we're going to throw a little bit of science at you today. I'm going to go through, we're going to all introduce ourselves as panelists. We're going to go through some principles of psychology and some research, and I will talk about those things. And then we're going to leave some time for your questions about dungeon mastering, tabletop role-playing games, psychological tricks, etc., etc. So let me just walk through this real quick, and then we're going to get started with the meat of our presentation. So my name is Amanda Lang. Yes, thank you. Yes. If you saw me yesterday, that's my cosplay. I wore that at Amber 21 yesterday. And you know, the funny thing is I wore it twice. I wore it at PAX, but people here liked it a lot. People at PAX were like, what? I think PAX skews too young now almost. I work at Microsoft. I'm an engineer at, software engineer, been there for about 5 years now. And the reason I have the Michigan State logo on there is because the research that I'm going to talk about today, I did while I was a student at MSU. I was a grad student at MSU. So I'm actually going to talk about grad student research that I did when I was a grad student. So that's kind of fun. I've done a lot of other things in my life. These are just the two things that are kind of burned this talk. And you can see me and my bros on the left there as my friends over at Microsoft, my coworkers. I have a lot of tabletop role-playing experience, both as a game master and as a player. I run a couple different genres of games. Right now I am running Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Shout out to a few of my players who are here today. Thank you. And we run our game on Twitch on Sunday afternoons. So if you want to watch me at work and my folks at work, twitch.tv/ellieface. I'll give you guys the cards and stuff later if you want to see it. But yeah, I didn't put any of my social media on here, so we'll share all that at the end of the talk. And then we're going to move on to Anne-Marie.
Hello, everybody. So I got my PhD in psychology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte, and I'm currently working at the American Institute of Physics. So psychology PhD, psychological techniques of DMing, just seemed like a good fit. So personally, I haven't DM'd myself, but I've been playing tabletop as a player for at least 12 years. And I've done Dungeons & Dragons, I've done Pathfinder, Exalted, and Deadlands, and my all-time favorite, Call of Cthulhu.
Call of Cthulhu, thank you.
Yeah.
My name is Daniel Greenberg. I'm an adjunct professor at George Mason University. I work in the computer game design department there, teaching first and second year students. My degrees are in information technology, computer science, and game design, so I come from more of a systems and sort of a technical background. That said, I'm also a high school dropout, worked for many years in a comic store. And my early background was in running RPGs. I was a GM, from an early age, kind of for a long time. I've been doing this for about 15 years. So picked up a lot of chances and opportunities to manipulate players along the way. Besides George Mason, I am also the founder of Winter Ion Game Studios, based out of the historic video gaming district of Clifton, Virginia. Just recently moved out to Maryland. You can find us on YouTube if you search for Winter Ion Game Studios.
So the reason that I propose this topic as a panel is not because this is a new idea, or because this research is new. In fact, I did this research more than a decade ago, which is crazy to me now, but true. And the stuff we're going to talk about in a lot of ways is based on really simple principles of psychology that have been around for a long time. But the reason that I decided to do this year is because there's been such a big explosion in tabletop gaming in general. And also in new DMs wanting to learn the ropes of how to become a new DM. I've seen so many people out there say, I'd love to get started playing, I don't know anything about how to start, I don't know. So what I wanted to do was talk about, a lot of the stuff that we've learned over those decades of experience and say, okay, this is stuff that you can do to get started, and this is stuff that will help you to up your game if you've already been doing it, or just examine the techniques that are already out there that are being used in the world. And when we get to the end and we have questions, if you have questions for any of us, of course we'll let you, chat about what your game problems you're having, et cetera, et cetera. One of the suggestions that Anne-Marie had was that we should talk a little bit about the Effector Zone. Is anybody here a fan? Okay, great. Wonderful. So a lot of people like Critical Role. I don't watch it as much. I did listen to all of the Effector Zone, and I'm not a big fan of it. I think a very fascinating thing about this is that as somebody who has DM'd for a super long time, you kind of watch Griffin learn how to DM, over the course of, and it's so public, and he has to learn super fast, and he goes through all these phases of learning how to be a better DM, and he makes like mistakes that you would make if you were a newbie DM, and I just find it so fascinating to listen to it like in order, and then he kind of hits the sweet spot and like really gets into what he's doing, but like the early ones are a little rocky just because like everybody's learning, and I love that about the Effector Zone. So we may be using some examples from this show, and there might be some spoilers. Hopefully that's okay with some people. If it's like, oh no, you're gonna spoil a thing, I don't know, statute of limitations stuff on like the first story arc, not like the newer stuff. And you wanted to add something about that too, or?
Oh, nope. If I do talk about, I'll try to stick to like an ambiguous example that like doesn't point out a plot point.
Sure. And we are going to be using actual science. So from here on, the next couple of slides, the next few slides are going to be talking about either my study or other studies that have existed doing psychology and how we apply that psychology to the tabletop sphere. So let's get started with some of these steps. So this is your slide here.
Sure. So has anybody heard of self-determination theory before in here? Okay, a few people. So this is an awesome theory that we use in psychology all the time, and it's all about how to foster motivation, engagement, and well-being during an activity. And I left it really broad because it can apply to so many things. So I encountered it in my health research, trying to get people to get motivated when exercising. So DDR is a great way to do that. They talk about using this theory for DDR, but use it a lot in games too. So they use it in user experience research and in game design, and it applies to tabletop gaming as well. So if you want to learn more about this theory, go ahead and check it out. So the three components are autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Right, go back one. So this is the three components. So she has a slide about each one.
Yeah. Okay, so we can move on. Yep. So autonomy, that is allowing players to act in accordance with their own goals and values. And it gives them a sense of meaning and purpose when they're engaging with the game. So this is like a really important concept that a lot of research has looked at. So before you even get started, the game at all, you gotta know who you're playing with. What are their goals when they're playing this game? Are they silly? They just want to relax and have fun and do ridiculous things? Are they a little more serious and they want to play it straight? Are they role players? Do they just want to do the battling? So that's something really important to assess when you're looking at autonomy. And giving players choices when you're able to in the story, whenever that makes sense. Keeping it ambiguous, but there was one Adventure Zone example I really liked when he gave Merle a new spell and then asked him, what do you think the spell looks like when you activate it? Like, that was a really small way of giving him some autonomy and saying, what do you think it looks like? And deciding when to stick to the rules or the setting and when you want to stretch the rules a little bit so the players can have more fun, and that's a tricky balance. And similarly, deciding when to punish in-game actions. If the players do something they're not supposed to do, how much are you going to bend the rules?
I will say that thing about describing spells and stuff. I know that the DM guide, for example, like, and I'm going to be using Dungeons & Dragons 5th a lot as my primary example, but I also run Call of Cthulhu a lot. So they always explain, like, this is how the spell works, and this is what it looks like, and here's the color. And I always throw that out, and I always let the player say, whatever color you want it to be. It's your spell, it's your character. If, as long as it doesn't change the in-game effect, like bend a rule. In 3.5, you actually had to like buy a feat to be able to do that. And I was like, that's so silly. Everybody should be able to describe their thing however they want. It's their fantasy. So similarly, I'm like, chill with your character wearing whatever they want. Like, it's okay if it's some impractical, crazy outfit, whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And then competence, this is feeling able and effective during the game. And this is a tricky balance. So there is some competence built into tabletop gamings, depending on the game you're playing. So giving them opportunities to use their new skills and abilities. So if your players choose their abilities, it makes them feel confident if they're able to use them effectively. So you have to design those scenarios. Scaling difficulty appropriately. You don't want the battles to be super easy, because that gets boring. You don't want it to be extremely difficult, or else everybody's going to die. And providing novel settings and situations that might allow them to try new skills or encourage problem solving. So one earlier arc of the Adventure Zone involves a mystery. So it's not just in the mechanics, but allowing the players to solve a mystery or something that engages them creatively. So you feel competent whenever you solve it at the end is a really important step.
And obviously a lot of these things are dynamic, right? When you're dealing with competence issues, you will discover over the course of when you're working on something, whether your players are picking up on specific things you're trying to sort of subtly telegraph to them, and if they're not, you start getting a little more overt about it. Or if you can see things shifting slowly in one direction or the other, if you can identify those things early enough and kind of feather touch them, you can usually steer things back without having to kind of give away the farm and admit like, okay, now we're going to scale back this encounter somewhat.
Yeah, and the last ingredient in this recipe for motivation is relatedness, which is feeling connected to others and feeling a sense of belonging. So that can be outside of the game and within the game. So fostering positive and healthy dynamics with the group, and we'll get into more examples of that. And also creating bonds with in-game characters, both between the characters that the players are playing and also the NPCs. So that's another thing the Adventure Zone does very effectively, is they feel very bonded to the in-game NPCs as well.
Yeah, he does a good job of making people care about the NPCs. It's interesting because a big community built up around that, and people drawing fan art and everything, and it's cool, to see that kind of engagement. And I think a lot of GMs would be envious of having that much engagement. But we have had some really cool engagement with being on Twitch, with people reaching out to us and creating, at one point, a video, like a commercial for our show and everything, and it was really fun. So we do get a little bit of community relatedness as well from streaming, and that's amazing. But I think it's also about that dynamic between the players.
There's also a bit of a feedback loop here between the autonomy and the relatedness issues, because as you empower your players and the people involved in your game to help establish and flesh out this world setting, you get a sense of ownership. With a sense of ownership, a community naturally fosters around that, and then you have people that start to feel more in tune with this thing because they are, no matter how small their particular contribution is to it, they're sort of helping build toward this larger continuity.
Yeah, and if they feel their goals are being achieved, then they feel more connected to the campaign and get more socially connected with the other players. That's true as well.
So I almost had a bridging slide here, but the next couple of slides are going over some of the techniques that I learned in my research, which is, here's what I'll tell you what the study was that I did, was I literally videotaped and audio taped 4 games being run. And they were from different DMs of higher skill level who've been DMing for a while, male and female, and they played D&D and Star Wars. So I had a couple different types of games to work with, and a couple different concepts they were doing for their games. And I took note of any time the GM needed to influence the players to do something, or the players needed the GM to do something, and what influence levers were used, and categorize all of those. So if you look up my thesis, which I'm sure I can find it somewhere, but it's under my maiden name, so it's under Amanda Flowers, which is my maiden name. But there's a copy available online. It's a short version, and it has more details about some of this stuff. But I want to talk a little bit about some of the examples that we looked over, and we'll all have examples because these are all things that are commonly used, but hadn't really been categorized or cataloged before. So if you want to get your players to do something, one easy way to do is to have a guy in the game tell them to do that thing. I know that seems really silly, but it's pretty much the hook of every opening module. If you buy a published adventure, there's a guy in the bar and he tells you that he needs you to do a thing and find a guy. That's one of the things you can do. You can also have what they call a character hook, which is your character is intrinsically interested, and this is more of an autonomy idea. Your character is intrinsically interested in finding thing. So, I know this person's character wants stuff familiar. They're going to go on a quest to go find that. The thing that I call focus here is if you are in the moment to moment in a game, and you put the players in a situation where there's a few things they can poke at, the more you describe something, the more interested they will be in poking at that thing. And if you look at the text in like a box text, for example, and you say like, oh, there's a treasure chest in here. Now this can backfire if you describe some random thing, and then this isn't what you hoped they would poke at. But it's also a great way to create like puzzles or red herrings or clues. Is something is unusual in this room, you can instantly say, because anytime you're in a dungeon mastering situation, so much is left up to the gap between your imagination and your player's imagination. And the only thing you can either fill it with is words, drawings, handouts. You can have visual aids, you can have miniatures. But there's some way that you have to communicate where people are and what they're seeing. And it's never going to be a perfect one-to-one unless you're like literally 3D modeling a video game every time you are a DM, which almost nobody's doing that. So maybe somebody out there that's that crazy. I've seen like the professional games where they have the gigantic props and they're super elaborate. Most of us are not at that place, right?
Right.
So you have to describe what people are seeing in the game. Now, the picture that I chose here is some laser ninjas, and the reason I did that is because an old GM of mine taught me this trick, and I've seen it used a lot in a lot of other people's games, which is the spontaneous conflict trick. And that is to say, if the game is dragging down or getting boring, he just said like, I'm gonna pull the ninja chain and have ninjas fall from the sky and attack you because it's boring now. And I will say that I did do this to my players at one point, or a couple of points, because at any point when I feel bored because people are arguing about something, it's way better to just have a combat spontaneously happen than to, like, but you guys, the bad guy heard you guys all blabbing and comes into the room and knocks it over. Or the time we ended up running through the jungle with like a bunch of Yanti chasing them down because they couldn't figure out where to go. Now their only goal was to go as far away from these guys as possible while they were shooting darts at them.
Nothing will bring your group together faster than a mutual enemy, and you have the power to drop them in at any time, at any place. Something you will also learn when we're talking about attractors is your players will develop a radar, especially as you work with them more and more. They will start to realize when things matter more or when they matter less. GMs, you will get this question a lot. What is the NPC's name? Like, you'll describe a person, what are they doing, and some information about them. If you hesitate for even a quarter second to give that person a name, they know you haven't named them, and how important are they really? The good news is for the players, especially the more you empower them, yes, we have someone, we need to flesh them out. What do you think this? What do you think? You can build, I've had games where completely innocuous NPCs have become so important to the party because they were the right vendor that had the right gear that they needed to buy at the right time, and they were visiting him 2 or 3 times and had sold this person things, that it showed up 6 months, a year and a half later in this campaign with upgraded versions of those same thing. You guys left this behind. I was bored. I just kind of tinkered with it for a while. It glows and it shoots things now. Have fun. You can really get some interesting results there if you leave enough opportunities for that authorship. Just be careful because your players are constantly sniffing out leads, and it will happen with what you don't expect and what you do. Because you can create as many hooks as you have planned, in advance. They will seek them out in other places too.
Mm-hmm. And of course, another way that you can attract players is with treasure. That's another obvious one. It's just the in-game reward. Like, if you do X, you're going to get Y. Or, this is a shiny item, you can go pick this up. Pretty simple stuff, pretty straightforward. The only thing that I would say about that is I'm obviously really generous a lot of the time, and sometimes it's like, oh man, my players have so much money now. Like, they have to spend it. They do. Like, I see Ellie nodding. Like, yes, we have so much money now. I have to find a way to get you to spend more money. Fortunately, they're just buying land, so that'll be fun. Just buying houses now. It's like Monopoly up in here. So I'm going to talk about a couple other attractors, and one of them is one of the heavier ones, which is the inverse instruction attractor, aka the Here There Be Gerblins attractor, which is to say, somebody telling your players not to do something.
Yeah, it's the best way to get them to do something.
Yeah.
It works super well, and that makes it extremely hard to actually tell them not to do something. Like, if you're serious. I did have a party wipe happen once because they didn't believe the lizard man when he said don't go into the dragon's lair from the front door. And there's a back entrance, and no, he said not to, so we're going to do it. But if you apply it carefully, it's a really good way to get people to do the thing that you want them to do by telling them not to do the thing that you want them to do. Yeah. Of course, NPCs are your tools as well. So anytime you can use an NPC to start up a mission, they go somewhere, do you follow them? Little things like that can cause players to act or not act. Or, hey, you meet an NPC, they're friendly, they're suspicious, whatever it is, it gets people interested, they want to talk to that person. And you can use phrases like asking the right questions, like instead of saying, what do you want to do, say, do you open the door? All that makes a difference, you know. You can tell people what they want, you want them to do, what you don't want them to do, kind of by telling them what you want, what you're thinking about. Now, here's some of the things that are usually detracting to players. At least I've discovered, or at least in my study discovered, a lot of times if there's like a higher level, tougher person in the room, players will be less likely to do stuff in the presence of that person, or they will defer to that person. And if anybody has read like some of the more recent Dungeons and Dragons modules that have come out, they throw a lot of authority figures in them. And the reason for the use of authority figures in these stories is to lead you one way and also like feel like an obstacle or a roadblock in a lot of cases. They just become this roadblock of like, I don't know if I can trust that person, or I don't know if that person trusts me. How do I get to the point where I can earn that person's trust? And I'm looking at my notes at this point, so if anybody has any other NPCs.
And these are NPCs you're talking about that are authority figures in the game?
Yeah. They usually, at least in the research that I've done, some players will be anti-authority, and they will always be like, screw that guy, I'm going to do whatever he tells me not to do, which is the inverse instruction thing. But other players, and in a lot of cases, the average group will say, okay, that guy's in charge, I probably should listen to them, as they usually are on better behavior in that case.
You'll have to feel your group out, but they'll usually use high-end NPCs as one of a few things. They will either use them, again, as guidelines, like, oh, well, we are a mostly good party, this is a mostly good NPC, they're above us, and like I can kind of get the sense of what we're supposed to be doing from them. Deference is always a big thing. You will also find sometimes they are used as, and this is something we tend to do as DMs more than players really, they're used as great symbols of growth. If you introduce somebody early in a game that is extremely strong, extremely competent, you don't even have to introduce them. You can have townspeople talking about legendary swordsman X, right? And then half a year later, they find themselves in a conflict where they are sort of on par with that person because you've allowed the group to kind of grow and mature, but you've left your sort of static NPC as is. It's an excellent opportunity to sort of communicate to your players their own progress and sort of their own overtime growth.
Yeah, good way to increase competence.
Yeah, the competence feeling. What suspiciousness means is not a suspicious player and character in this case. It's the opposite of the focus thing, where you describe something really elaborately, and then they go, oh, that sounds dangerous. I don't want to touch that. That sounds really suspicious. So that's one of the reasons that you have to be careful when you describe stuff. Like, oh, like there's like, you know, in our game there's like, oh, there's this lamp, and it looks like an angry sun. Well, I don't know if I want to touch the angry sun lamp, you know. What happens if I really carefully touch it? And there's I just saw, and this is another Effector Zone thing, but it's one of their live shows, and they're in the Tomb of Horrors, and there's like a chest that opens up, and he walks over, and it's like, well, wait a minute, you know that chest is a trap, I know that chest is a trap, do you really want to walk over and look at that thing that's obviously going to be a deadly trap? And then, oh, you're right, okay, I don't touch the chest, and that's it, yeah. And then eventually he sticks his arm in it, but you know.
Right.
But if you have got the players into the mindset of stuff that's elaborately described will probably kill you, then stuff that's elaborately described they won't mess with. And that can be a problem if you do want them to mess with it, so you're going to be careful about that. The easiest way to get people to not touch a thing is to just not give them anything at all. And that is to say, not even, just like to say, oh, nothing happens. Nothing happens. Nothing happens when you do that. It's not really a thing. Eventually they'll be like, oh, okay, that's not a thing. That's not an object that's important to the story.
And And that's a good point here with the whole concept of lack of reward. Not all rewards are necessarily shiny things, right? Rewards might be progress. Rewards might be a sense of accomplishment. The reward might be changing the state of the scenario you've got them in. When you give a completely neutral response and there is no sort of reward, it's a great way to sort of refocus them or tune them elsewhere.
Yeah, because even just something different happening is kind of a reward in a way, especially if they're in a situation where it's like a puzzle, like, oh, you heard a click. That meant something. Oh, you didn't hear it. Then nothing happened. And that's how you kind of can explain to people what's going on in a mechanical situation like that. And of course, the two big ones, damage and death. Yeah, if you touch that and it burns your hand off, you're not going to touch that again unless you think you really have to. And if the character really is persistent and, does the wrong thing, they can die. Now, I want to do a little side talk about death because I really don't like it when player characters die, and I'm kind of softy about that. Mm-hmm. But it does happen in D&D and games like it, and you have to treat it as, I'm a big proponent. If anything is really important, I don't hide my die roll. I do fudge. I've done fudge dice before, players. I do sometimes. If I think it would be less. If it doesn't matter as much, and it's like you're chewing through minions, and maybe they had 3 hit points left, I'm gonna go ahead and just give you the kill, because this is not that big of a deal. But if it's super duper important, I don't like to hide my roll, because I feel like if it's life or death, the dice really have to be the arbiter and not just my fiat in that matter. So for that kind of stuff, I think it's important to be kind of honest and go by the rules. But many games are not as rule heavy as Dungeons and Dragons, and they have different rules for how to handle death. So I invented a Transformers RPG.
That's awesome.
Thank you. It was amazing, and I ran it for 3 years, and it was epic. But here's how I did death in that game. You had to bid your spark. That was the stat. You had to bid it. And if you bid every point you had, you were definitely going to die that day. But if you didn't bid every point you had, you didn't have the maximum amount of skills to roll. So basically, you put as much as you're willing to do into a scene. And if it wasn't a life and death situation, you were probably going to make it out okay. But if it was, your rolls were better, but you were probably going to die. So the stakes were higher the harder you fought. And I thought that was a really nice way of letting players have the autonomy to choose their death scene and whether or not the situation was important to them.
It goes a long way too with the setting, theme, system. There's some intrinsic, extrinsic knowledge going on here, knowing what your players are looking for in the game that you're producing for them, the setting that you have either worked with, or a setting that you've taken stock and used, or something you're collaborating on. Kind of understanding the underlying themes of that and the sort of the heaviness of that. What's the weight to death? Are you dealing with sort of one theme that's intended to focus on loss, or one that's perhaps more focused on something a little lighter like friendship, and trying to establish the level of sort of death or damage you want to deal in that.
And I had one point about death, and this is why Call of Cthulhu is my all-time favorite. Woo! I actually like it when death isn't as big a deal in a game, where in Call of Cthulhu, it's not a matter if you die, it's when you die, for those who haven't played it. And I feel it kind of gives me more power and autonomy, because in Dungeons & Dragons, I have to play more conservatively. So I'm thinking, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't do that really risky thing and risk all of my party members, because it'll be serious if we die. But in Call of Cthulhu, I can be crazier.
True.
Yeah, I can rush headlong into danger and see what happens. And
your character's fragile anyway.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
I can cast that really crazy spell and lose all my sanity points. So I think that sometimes death is a detractor, but sometimes, depending on the system and the world, it can be empowering and freeing in a way as well.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, it gives you the freedom to try new stuff and see what happens and make things dramatic. You talked about extrinsic versus intrinsic knowledge. You want to go a little bit more depth into that?
Sure.
Because this is the metagame stuff. This is stuff that happens on the level above the game. Other things that you can do.
So something you're going to have to account for is you'll have players at different skill levels at your table, potentially, but also what they may or may not know about the game you're playing, the system you're in, the setting that you're choosing. Players will migrate in with a certain expectation, a certain set, right? They may feel dwarves fit a certain fiat that they've built for them in their minds. This is, and this is extrinsic information that they're bringing into the game. It's not an RPG example, but it's the best example I've ever thought of, so I'm just going to jump over Sid Meier's Civilization real quick. When you're playing Sid Meier's Civilization, you have a certain extrinsic knowledge of a lot of these world leaders, so even though you may, in the first couple turns of a game, just built your first civ, and you have maybe a light cavalry, and you're working on your first settler, and a scout comes from Genghis Khan, and says, it's really nice to meet you. You have a nice civilization here. Oh, you have the alphabet. Well, we have the wheel. Would you like to trade? And you go ahead, establish the trade. Oh, they seem really nice. Intrinsic knowledge there. Oh, I have an interesting neighbor somewhere that wants to trade scientific knowledge with me. The extrinsic knowledge is you stop building the settler and start building a city wall. Because you happen to know something that is outside the invisible boundaries of the game in question. And this will happen in tabletop all the time. You're always going to be dealing with players who have certain knowledges that they are bringing out, even if it's just the way that you choose to communicate your game, they will start to learn things about the world and the setting that may be even beyond the character's knowledge. And you have to kind of be careful, monitor that, check that, and feed how much info you're giving them on that, because you will build up their extrinsic knowledge over time, especially as they start to feel you out as a dungeon master.
Yeah, I have a good example of that in a social in-game interaction. So in our 5th edition D&D campaign, there was a situation where we had an item, it was a stone, and it acted like the One Ring from the Lord of the Rings, where you get drawn to it and you want to keep it, and it has these weird effects. So one of our players got a hold of it, and so now we have to role play it, and so that player has to act like they don't have it and try to hide it, so that intrinsically the in-game player shouldn't know that the player has it, but extrinsically all the players know that you have it and they know it's bad. So we kind of ran into a situation where that role-playing didn't work because the players in real life didn't want to go along with the role-playing.
And in a lot of situations, you have to pass notes. So I ran a Call of Cthulhu game that I've run a couple times at cons and it's always a blast. Everybody has their sanity effects in sealed envelopes.
Oh, that's excellent.
So when they lose sanity points, they open up the envelope and read what happens to them, and it's unique for each player. Now, in case we ran it live, they actually did read about that, and it was pretty fun. But you can keep that secret as well. So you could say, oh, well, I'm going to tell people, I'm not going to tell people what happened to me, and it kind of brings this little bit of can I trust the other players to the situation, which again, in Call of Cthulhu is kind of a fun thing. Mm-hmm. Not always a fun thing in some games, but in Call of Cthulhu it's kind of fun. There's a point on this slide too that I talk about, which is hassle, and that refers to metagame hassle, which is to say a player won't do something if the rules for it are a pain in the ass. Yeah, grappling, exactly. You have to look up a grappling tip. Everybody say grappling. Yeah, they made this a pain in the ass, and so I don't want to do it. Oh, that spell is a pain in the butt. I have to look up 3 tables and blah, 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 and I just don't want to bother. So people just generally won't unless it's they're certain it's the optimal thing and they have the rules memorized, which you also can, you can have in your life. But often, if you run into a situation that feels like a spontaneous situation, oh, we're going to do this whole falling damage thing. Oh, we're going to do this thing that it's going to be a pain and I don't want to do that. So what you as a GM can do is just make up a different rule for it. Mm-hmm. And not worry about looking up the printed thing, because you want to make it fun and have fun and not worry about making it super duper accurate. One of the things that I've liked about more recent D&D editions is they've eliminated a lot of the hassle. They really have streamlined a lot of the stuff that was oh, this is really fiddly. A lot of stuff in 3.5 was really fiddly to me. And you had to look up specific, oh, well, you can't do that because you don't have fletching. Oh, your prestige class requires 8 levels of this and 4 levels of that. I don't know. It's a lot less fiddly now, and I'm perfectly good at that. But if you want people to not do something, just make the rules for it really complicated and annoying, and they probably won't bother.
That's great. The good news is with that simplification too, you mentioned the Twitch channel. Mm-hmm. This helps with the external agents coming in too, because you can actually sort of better relate and understand, because if you're not the player, if you are not, if you're there for the plot, obviously it's a little easy to get lost in the weeds, as the games tend to simplify a little bit, and sort of the big 5ed D&D Twitch thing that's become a thing of late has certainly sort of helped communicate that if you are working in sort of this new media format, it really helps to have a streamlined system. Something else worth mentioning when you talk about note passing It is 2019. We have amazing technological devices to surreptitiously communicate with our players so they do not know that you are telling them a certain thing if you don't want to telegraph or give away that you are like communicating something secret to a player. But sometimes you want to telegraph that you are communicating secretly to a single player because you want everyone else at that table to be paranoid.
Yes.
So if you want to elicit that sensation, you are completely capable of doing it. Just know that you also have the ability to communicate anything you need to, like on an individual basis. Having something like Discord on hand at any time. And every player at your table is probably going to have a smartphone, so you can ping things back and forth to them really easily.
And there are the times when you will have to get to the point of kicking somebody out of your game. If there's actual behavioral problems, that is the final straw. If there's a situation where, you know what, this isn't working out, or you know what, I don't know if the timing is right for you, or maybe your character doesn't fit the group, or whatever. And that's one of the reasons we have this thing called Session Zero. I'm a big proponent of Session Zero. I usually write a document before I start a campaign talking about who I am, what I like, what I don't like, what the game's going to be like, and kind of a social contract to determine what people are into and what they're not into. And it doesn't say that things don't break down sometimes and everything's always perfect if you just do this thing once. Sometimes you have to take a step back and be like, hey, what do we like? What don't we like? What do you guys feel is the next direction we should go in? Anything you change? And in my case, I'm probably pretty close to time for that conversation. We kind of have it on Discord now. We're just like, hey, for the next couple weeks, what sounds fun? I have a couple ideas. What direction do you want to take the game in? Because we do have the technology now to help that. But if you've never heard of Session Zero, ground rules for a campaign are pretty important going in. And just to make sure everybody's on the same page and they kind of understand what your idea of fun is, because it is about your fun as well as theirs.
Right, and it's all about setting expectations. So unless you have that setup session to properly set up the expectations, players are going to run with it and have their own interpretations. And then when they're told in the game, oh, well, you can't do that, or you can't do this, that's when you're going to get frustration and more negative emotions, and they're not going to have a good time. So I think that's also important, is setting up just not the rules, but like what you as a DM expect from player behavior. Are you going to allow them to do really insane things or immoral things, or do you want it to be more realistic and
right.
kind of more down to earth?
What's your realism level? What's the survivability level of the campaign? Is it going to be very deadly? Are we going to do meat grinder rules? All that kind of stuff is important to establish up front. I have one more slide and then we'll take questions. But I do want to talk a little bit about some of the things that you can do in other mediums that you can't do as a DM, and some of the things that will cause some of these tricks to not work. Your mileage may vary. One of the things I noticed when I was watching GMs is that a lot of times, like even in a published module, who's familiar with Earthbound? Oh yeah, okay, great, cool, because I want to put this line here. Spoilers for Earthbound. This is Buzz's tombstone. R.I.P. So Buzz appears very early on in Earthbound, and he's like this super duper powerful alien bee that gives you a bunch of info dump and then dramatically dies. And you can't do that in a role-playing game. It doesn't frickin' work. Because the players will do everything in their power to rescue that person, and then they're just not going to dramatically die, and it's just not going to work out. So don't try to do that unless you're like, no, God himself smites Buzz. He never exists ever again. I'm going to try and save Buzz. And then Buzz is just going to hang out for the rest of the campaign. And, being an ultra-powerful psychic alien bee or whatever, it's really, really hard to kill a mentor character or something unless you, really build up to it and people are really expecting to, you see you give me a look like, I don't think that's true. But I watched people, if a messenger boy crawls and he gives you the thing and then he passes out. Oh, I cast healing. Oh, I'm going to get him resurrected. They're just not going to let that dude die. And it's like, no, his job in the story is done. Players don't like to allow that to happen. You have to sort of just tell them, no, let him die now. Another really, really tough thing, and this is me speaking as a DM who's done this a lot, if you want a super duper cool bad guy to survive, you gotta really work hard sometimes to let that guy live. Yeah. It's real easy to kill bad guys in 5e. I wanted to have a boss fight with multiple rooms. That doesn't happen. They try to get away. It's very, very tough. You've got to be willing to let those guys go, or you have to have them work through minions and stuff a lot and never actually encounter the players face to face, and that works pretty well. I had a pretty good long-running 4th edition bad guy who pretty much just only talked to them through crystals and stuff. That works real good. You can't just have them show up physically, because unless there's other 1 billion levels above the player when they first encounter them, they might be toast. So you gotta watch out for that. Yeah.
It's the Dr. Claw rule, essentially, right?
Yeah.
As long as you have them a sufficient distance away, they can send any number of antagonists out. I will admit, because this is a very painful memory for me, I missed out on 2 complete hooks in a long-running 3-year game that I built with a specific antagonist who wasn't the main antagonist, but my party was clever enough to somehow get him into a bag of holding. So, really, one of the 4 or 5 lieutenants on which I had entire arcs of story planned was parked in a player's bag of holding that they were using frequently enough that they were actually risking getting items from a bag with a vampire in it. And I had to try to sort of manage this problem, and I never really came up with a good answer for it. So I had to sort of quietly, without actually complimenting them on their brilliance, just kind of go on and move on to the next thing and scale a dozen encounters down about 1.5 levels each and accept it and move on. You will get some weird issues with either killing off NPCs or not killing off NPCs. It takes practice. You're going to have to learn to roll with the punches on this one. Don't be surprised if midway through your campaign you're drafting up another character you didn't think you were going to. It happens.
And forgetting player abilities happens a lot on the Adventure Zone, because he gives him so many magic items, and then he's like, oh, damn it, I forgot you had that thing.
Or with spells, like, oh wait, can you cast that spell?
Right, especially magic users, oh wait, I didn't realize that spell could do that. I guess you can just walk through the wall and skip the whole encounter. It's hard to keep track sometimes. It just is. And there's uncooperative players that just generally get in your face and make your life difficult, and that's when you sometimes have to go metagame and say, hey, this isn't cool. And then missing the hook, kind of just, the NPC said to go to this place, but I forgot. Now where are we going again?
You'll tell players things that you think you are giving sufficient weight or import, and they'll file it away, and maybe they're not the best note takers at your table, or they'll transcription error, they heard something wrong, they did something wrong. And 2 or 3 sessions later, after going through a dungeon, why are we in here again? Well, what was it we were doing? And then you have to, you hear muffled, cries from inside, the box at the end of the hall. Were we rescuing somebody? Louder, muffled cries. So you have to be careful here, because obviously, as a DM, you are also sort of a director, right? And so your language, the way, whatever you communicate to your players is sort of your narrative, and it's also going to highlight, we talked about focus, right? Narrow focus, wide focus. It's going to give focus to players on actions and objects, and you have to make absolutely clear that the things that you do want them to do, you're kind of migrating them. We have a term in video games like alleys and islands, right? When someone's on an island, they can freely run in any direction. It's, they can go where they will. When they're in an alley, you're kind of narrowly walking down a thing. We have to make things feel like islands as often as we can, and sometimes for narrative purposes, we have no choice but to put you in an alley. It just really helps when you can make one feel like the other.
Mm-hmm. So we have some time now to take your questions. I know there's not a ton of time, but let's just, if there's a microphone out there, I'm also going to quickly add some social media to a slide, because I forgot to do that, so you guys know where to find us as well. So I will do that, and if we can, I saw a hand go up right there in the green hat. We can start there and kind of work our way around.
I can talk loud.
Okay.
Okay.
Is this actually going to be shared online anywhere to rewatch?
So MAGFest is really great in that almost all of these panels are recorded.
Twitter?
This one is being recorded. Hi, hey YouTube, how's it going? You can expect this whenever the MAGFest channel gets it up and running. These will get released along with concerts and other MAGFest content. We will probably, as we usually do, also clone this video over on the Winter on Game Studios channel, since we tend to do most of the WGS stuff is on there too.
Okay, I saw your hand go up, and then we'll go over here. Yeah, go ahead.
What are your thoughts on giving players' autonomy over the story? I mean, obviously when you write anything, it becomes the players just as much as yours as soon as you like unveil it into their world, but autonomy is in really narrative power and narrative control. What are your thoughts on just like best practices for that? How you would use it or not use it in your specific game?
I'll real quickly, I'll attack. My general thumb is I kind of have an algorithm for writing out my games. I know pretty well in advance how it starts, how it ends, and 2 to 3 sort of climactic events that are going to occur throughout the course of the game. Depending on the system I'm running and the players I'm running and about how long I expect the game to go, I'll usually try to time out those climactic events when players are hitting certain precipices, certain strengths, right? 4th edition had this really clear delineation, heroic, epic, paragon, where the different tiers kind of represented rough strength levels. So it had natural Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 sort of style to it. The problem was it was over 30 levels, and unless you had a group that was willing to really stick it out for years, or you were willing to kind of fudge the timeline a little bit and say every week we're sitting down to play, like a couple weeks to months have passed, and they're literally seeing the this is your lifestyle arc of a character, there's sort of a weird dilation that happens there. My recommendation is to make sure that you have the critical points of your story hammered out well in advance. You don't have to communicate them to the players necessarily. They'll do a really good job of working with you to fill in the gaps between those climactic events.
I used to call this the underpants gnomes theory of story design, and I thought that I invented this, but then I saw other people using it, and I was like, oh, we got the brainwave, which is like you got the beginning, which is collect underpants, and then you got the question marks in the middle, and then you have profit. So you have to have a strong hook at the beginning, and you have to have something exciting happen at the end. The stuff in the middle, it's okay if you haven't got it figured totally out yet. And if you have a bad guy that you think is really cool, but you don't know what their ultimate plan is, a thing that you can do is kind of have them just do something stupid, and then see how the players react to that, and then figure out later what their ultimate plan was, as the players kind of tell you what they think the ultimate plan was. Or like, oh, I don't know what the weakness is of this bad guy yet, but if they give me some ideas as to what the weakness is of this bad guy, that's going to fill in the blanks. Everybody's going to feel good about themselves because I came up with an idea and you came up with an idea. So sometimes I will deliberately introduce a plot hole in the game. And to figure out later why that thing happened, because that way it kind of becomes a discovery adventure for everyone, not just for the players, but for me, because I can figure out how do I make these two events connect to each other in a cool way.
Yeah, and I think as long as you have a clear goal, like you were saying, like clear story points that they had to get to and letting them know about that, then they can kind of get there how they want, but you do have to have that goal. Because if you just let them figure out the goal for themselves, then it's easier, I think, for them to get lost.
I feel like endings matter, and there needs to be some kind of cool climax or something that you're working toward. You got a hand up, go ahead, and then over here. Yeah.
So I'm an experienced player, but I'm about to be a first-time GM.
Cool, congratulations.
A module which is notorious for being really high lethality called Rap and Ethic. And there's a two-part question. On a scale from 1 to 10, how much do you enjoy the suffering of your players? And as a second part, do you have any tips for running a high lethality game?
I'm kind of a softie, and I don't usually run high lethality unless I'm running Call of Cthulhu, and in which case it's just kind of funnier because then it's like, oh, I like to run a high sanity loss game. I think that's more funner.
I think so too.
What do you guys think? High lethality?
I'm generally cool with it when I'm running. Well, when I was younger, I ran RPGA stuff a lot. It was more fun because I don't know them in real life. I don't have to feel bad about this 6 months or a year down the road when they're reminding me over and over again that I killed their favorite character. It's a little easier. When you have your social dynamic and you have your group, they're going to go a long way in deciding the lethality of your game. Setting's going to have something to do with it, but really knowing the people you're sitting down and playing with, right? Do they want to have 2 or 3 characters? Do they mind losing one? I had a game where they all created one character, with the full knowledge that as NPCs were introduced to them over the course of this adventure, they were going to be added to the party. and that they were welcome at any time they wanted to hand over manila folders of, well, I'm going to play the paladin we found last week, this week. And it was a larger group party thing. And as they kind of got more and more attached to these, they started to get favorites, and their favorites weren't necessarily the character they created at level 1. Which is great, because then they also have a portfolio of 12 or 13 characters among 4 or 5 players, so if one bites it, or if I surreptitiously communicate with one player to make that one betray them, that they thought they trusted and could bring into the circle of PCs, and that one turned out to be somebody that, you know, backstabs them. Oh, look, the backstabber just walked into the room right now as we talk about it.
Sorry.
So yeah, I actually coordinated with Morsius there to have his Inquisitor feed information to the antagonists of the campaign and then backstab them about halfway through it. So
I have gleefully killed player characters, but only when it was dramatically appropriate.
Right.
That's my heart. I want it to feel really good. Like I don't want it to be like just some random guy gets offed, but I want it to be like you earned that death.
Yeah. And we play high lethality games. We make sure that the character creation process is fast, because that's really what people don't want to do, is redo the whole character creation process. You don't want to stall it. So that's a really great example of how to streamline it. Or just doing like basically the same character again, like, oh, Bob died, here's Rob.
we've
done that
roguelike solution.
Yeah, we've done that many times.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
Alright, how do you dissuade your players from becoming murder hobos? Which is essentially like,
Session 0. Like tell them don't be murder hobos.
I've tried, but just eventually it kind of devolves into that.
Look, if I
Are there any tips you have to dissuade us?
or otherwise persuade
So
word
the question for those of you in the back room here is, how do you get the players to not be murder hobos? And the idea of a murder hobo is like the players, they just murder and kill everything in their path and take their stuff, and they don't pay attention to any story, and they blah blah blah. Okay, first of all, my solution is like, tell people you're gonna want to run that kind of game, but if that's the kind of game they want to play in, I mean, whatever. That's their fun, and that's their fun. And a lot of the stuff that we went over earlier in the talk is the kind of stuff that you should look at. It's stuff like, is an authoritative NPC present? They're going to want to be on better behavior. Are they going to be able to take that guy out in a hit and make that guy stronger? Like, make it so they have to deal with authority that they wouldn't necessarily have to deal with, because authority
And the consequences of those actions.
Yeah, and consequences. Like, it's tough because sometimes you can't think of consequences, but you have to be able to kind of roll with, okay, there's gonna be I'm not just gonna put them in jail and make them break out again, because that's boring. So think of something like a more interesting, deeper level of consequence. Maybe disrupt an entire kingdom's political situation, and then you've got a war on your hands, and people are fighting, and it's all the fault of your murder hobo players. I mean, at least it's interesting. Keep the story somewhere.
Human beings in general, will run cost-benefit analysis on almost anything. We talked about if it takes too long to make a character and it's too easy for a character to die, people will eventually get tired of the game. If your players run CBA on stab and grab and determine that there are too many consequences and not enough benefits, and look, I love River City Ransom as much as the next person, but if I'm getting like pennies and nickels from every single thing I stab, and every opportunity I have to fight is like a life or death opportunity, like the 50-50 chance of dying isn't worth the minuscule reward that I get for engaging that action. So you can control even sort of players who, because they're just looking for the easy solution, or the solution that's going to drive them closest to the type of gameplay they want. They are trying to minimize their own costs.
Yeah, and that lack of reward is powerful. That lack of reward trajectory is really powerful. Like, just don't give them stuff. Let's take a couple questions from the very back, just because way back left, I see your hand up. Yeah, go ahead. And then we'll try and get a couple, and then we're almost out of here. But thank you, guys.
So my murder hobo group was actually involving my father, which is awful, because I actually had the book, everything was great. But they smelled the blood in the water at the very end of the campaign. I was like, guys, I'm about to monologue and give you the last bit of information you really need. And they just stepped. I was like, how do I finish the story, guys?
How do you get the final villain monologue out when they bum rush him and go right to initiative?
That's that antagonist survivability problem. It's a huge problem. Yeah. You got to put a magic wall up or something. It's one of those live and learn things.
I've seen one very effective form of this, by the way, they do not have to stop talking just because the combat has begun.
That's another thing.
Nothing will make your players hate an enemy more than an enemy that uses every one of their turns to continue to monologue while they are fighting. Right? Attacks, parry, dodge, not even reacting necessarily or taunting your way back and forth, but just continuing their thought process during that fight. And by the way, you have control over their hit points. So yes, you can finish the paragraphs. When you get to about the halfway point of the paragraph, maybe you start to change their description a little bit, they start a little weathered, a little bloody, maybe you start to deliver their lines a little more ragged. You can ham it up a little bit if you want. You have total control over what they're saying and how long they're saying it. Never let your players take that away from you.
We have had some, Ellie in particular, some really good final boss one-liner exchanges. So.
Stitches get stitches!
Just get stitches. So, go ahead and let them have that conversation. Talking is a free action. So if you have dialogue, say it. Back far right, maybe? Sure, yeah, go ahead, go ahead, yes.
Okay. So I've been a forever player like years, and I'm kind of just starting. My group will tell you that I'm Spotlight Horde, excuse me. But how do is there any way I can turn that into a positive with jamming? Is there any way that I can pass that along without being obvious that I realize I talk too much?
Oh, you mean as a GM or as a player?
As a GM.
Oh, okay. Just give more control to your players. I know it's hard, but let them just dictate some of the pace. It can be a real challenge, but if you like doing funny voices or whatever, I will get the answer in front of you, and then these two in the front here, and then we're probably almost done. So go ahead.
Hey, so player, GM, alternate.
Yeah.
So I'm not. You know what the warp effect is? Just so I can.
What's the warp effect?
So it's named after the Star Trek Next Generation.
Actually, I know who Worf is, but I mean.
Yeah. Well, just the people who don't know. And so Worf is badass. And whenever someone would beat the hell out of Worf, they're like, oh, that guy's a super badass.
Oh.
Stunticon.
Yeah.
So. It's one of my favorite tricks as a GM to establish stakes, but I feel like you can get a little bit trite because it's sort of like the shonen anime escalation of power levels.
That's what it is, yeah.
Well, in the Transformers, the rule we used was the Stunticon rule, which was that anytime anybody was brand new, they got to be a totally cool badass for one scene, just to prove how totally cool badass they were, even if they weren't going to be totally cool badass later.
I guess my question is, how do you do you have any tricks reining that in, using it in a way that's a bit more effective than just as a constant?
I'd say as a writer, if you need to escalate the stakes, you find a way to do it, but you don't always need to do that. You can have antagonists or protagonists in your story be eliminated without necessarily raising the threat level or the stakes of it, right? The best way to do that is to try to find a threat of equal level for one side or the other. Try to narrow the scale of the conflict. They don't have to be badly beaten. They can barely lose, right? You can bring the conflict level and the struggle level down just enough. And just like we talked about with the whole meddlesome thing with oh no, they're almost dying, revive them, or whatever. This can have happened 20 minutes before, right? You can sort of pull the Ozymandias trick and say, I would never have told you about this friend of yours dying if I thought there was any chance in the world you could have saved them. They died outside 20 minutes ago. And the guard that tells you this can flash them back and describe the scene and explain that this sort of equal level conflict has occurred. There's lots of ways you can remove characters, protagonists or antagonists from your game without necessarily raising the stakes or raising the threat level. It's just a matter of how you use your narrative to convey what's eliminating them.
Good. Yep.
My question is about doling out information. I have 8 players, so amongst them, they can pretty much get information out of a stone if they want to.
Sure.
And therefore, withholding information is a little bit difficult. So do you have any tips for...
When you're withholding, are you saying I'm gonna roll convince, I'm gonna roll persuade, and we're gonna eat each other and we're gonna figure it out? Or is it more of a they just ask you a lot of questions?
They ask a lot of questions and they can literally interrogate anything.
Oh, okay.
What do you think? What's a good way?
Well, if you have a table of Poirots, if you have players who are so cunning as to sort of piece together your plots, One of the effective tricks you can use is to not actually have everything available. Don't solve your own mystery. Build the first chunk of your mystery, set it up, right? So you have this issue, you can introduce the players and introduce the threat and sort of run a first arc, beginning to end, which concludes with, oh, we have determined it's murder. Then you start with a fresh set of facts and a fresh set of information, you kind of run them through a second thing, because that way, you mitigate the risk of if players are piecing together too much of this and they figured it out from the get-go, worst case scenario, they've only figured out the first act of your plot.
So I had a situation where a lot of interrogations were happening, and they were happening of NPCs that didn't have complete information, and it was getting tedious for me. So I just leveled with the player at that point and said, like, hey, you know what? These guys don't really know what's outside of this area, but I'll tell you what, anytime you want to interrogate a guy, roll charisma, I'll give you a slip with some information on it, and we'll move on. And then I want to level with you, they don't know. So, and that was like a weird conversation to have, because like I try to keep things in game, but sometimes you have to go and be like, hey, yeah, this guy doesn't know, man. Like he only has the key to room G and he doesn't know what's in room X.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Oh, he does? Okay, yeah, oh, okay, what's up?
So how is it I can best get my players to have more emotional role play during a game? There's one thing when they're like, oh, I'm running from being killed, and yeah, I'm really scared. But how do I get them to like sit down and say, all right, during the not high points of the story, to actually have more investment in the emotional arc of their character?
That's a super great question, and it can be really hard depending on the players that you have and how to get them out of their shell. The most important thing is for people to be comfortable with one another and trust each other, because you're displaying a kind of fake vulnerability that will be like a real vulnerability. If you want to get attached to something, you're going to allow yourself to be vulnerable. And in that situation, the most important thing is that there's a dynamic of trust and communication between the players in your table. Because if everyone is on the defensive, they'll be afraid to let themselves get hurt in that way. And that's the most important thing that I would say. It's like, just let it happen, let people be open to it. I struggle with this myself sometimes, but a strong NPC can be really good motivator for people.
Yeah, I think what we've done sometimes, like Exalted, there was a lot more emotional role play in that game. Sometimes it was about pairing up into dyads. So if you have a lot of people in the group, sometimes it's hard to have like an emotional role-playing moment among 5 or more people. So sometimes if you pair people off or set up a scene with a fewer subset of players, they can get into that emotional role play moment.
The system does matter too, because you're talking about Exalted, and it's a storyteller system game that has a lot of like mechanics for charisma and persuasion and stuff like that already baked in. And I based my Transformers RPG around that kind of a system as opposed to a Dungeons & Dragons kind of system, because I enjoyed the emotional content that could be provided from that sort of interaction. And I do think system matters. I think if those things are more codified, you will get more of that type of play, for sure.
This is more just adding on to that.
Yeah.
But it's like you said, there's not really a lot of codified rules for it in Dungeons and Dragons, but like the whole inspiration thing is a good place to go with it too. Like if your players do good at the whole like role playing thing and like character interaction, give an inspiration for that, like reward them, and they'll enjoy that. And that sort of like encourages more of that as you go along, or you can come up with your own ways of rewarding.
Yeah, we actually built at one point a morale system, not only for the players but for the regions and the towns and the places that they had either liberated or worked with over the course of an adventure. And as they built sort of this sort of relationship and kinship with people and with organizations, they started to find like volunteers joining their army from specific locales that wanted to work with them. They were meeting like the sons and daughters of characters that they had met what was like years prior for places they had saved. When you start to sort of reveal the rewards of their actions and kind of communicate to that, it's a way to sort of build that in. But if you have players that are entirely numbers driven and it's going to happen, yes, things like inspiration or simply allowing them to spend morale points on, maybe they can turn a critical hit into critical hit against into a normal hit against because they are, sort of anchored by the faith or resolve of the actions they have been doing, or maybe you allow them an additional roll on a saving throw versus something because they've built up that sort of emotional strength of that well to draw from.
And like, this is another like example from the Adventure Zone, but near the end he switches to a different game system and stops playing Dungeons & Dragons for a little while, and it's because he wants to use a different type of interaction and reward a different type of interaction, and not everybody clicked with that, but I having been somebody who's experimented a lot with indie storytelling games, and there's a lot of cool indie storytelling games out there. Some of them are very niche, some of them have very like small focuses compared to D&D, some of them are very broad. You may want to just explore what other games are out there and how they handle that, just to see different approaches to emotional storytelling, and then maybe just kind of breaks you out of your box a little bit, and maybe break your players out as well.
And that's another good example of having great payoffs to emotional role playing.
Guys, we're kind of out of time. I think nobody's come and told us to leave yet, but I don't know. They're gonna kick us out. So I see a couple more hands up. We'll take questions until they kick us out. I'll take yours right here, and then from the back. Yep.
So,
But thank you all so much for coming.
Yes, seriously,
Thank you so
really
much.
appreciate everything. Thank you.